While Judaism has many monsters in its folklore, there is perhaps none more famous than the artificial humanoid, the Golem. Often thought of as the product of fear, rage, and arcane sorcery, the legend of the Golem is tied to the most obscure and brief text in all of Jewish mysticism, the Sefer Yetzirah, or the Book of Formation. This book has had a massive impact on all forms of the Kabbalah. Almost every detail about the origins, nature, and even the content of this book remain hotly debated by kabbalists, academics, and ritual practitioners. Both as a spiritual practice and as an area of academic research, the basic facts about its origins remain very mysterious. It isn't clear, aside from vaguely Southern Europe, exactly where it developed or the people responsible for its early development. It isn't clear where the early texts of the Kabbalah were composed or by whom. It's not clear how they fit together, both internally, but also how they fit together as a genre. The symbols used in literature are polysemic, inconsistent, and sometimes downright contradictory. Seemingly technical terms shift meaning abruptly, and vary significantly from text to text, and sometimes from paragraph to paragraph. The major figures seem to speak in a code that they haven't quite worked out yet. The effect is profoundly jarring. So much so that at this early level of composition, one could have easily imagined a dozen systems emerging rather than just one. Though, to be honest, the Kabbalah has never been one unified system. It seems to have always followed a time signature that no human being can quite keep up with. So what are we to do? I think the best thing to do is to take a look at the text of the early Kabbalah on their own terms. Rather than reading the Kabbalah back onto them, let us imagine that each one survived on their own individually. What then could we say about them? What are their major theories and concerns? When and who wrote them? In this episode of Esoterica, we're continuing our series on the early history of the Kabbalah, by exploring these questions and more as we turn to the enigmatically brief but mystically packed Sefer Yetzirah, or Book of Formation. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. So I want to start with a bit of a disclaimer. Here at Esoterica, I work hard to provide the best scholarly resources to the material I discuss, and I try to provide you with the most up-to-date research and academic consensus that I can. That said, almost everything I'm going to say in this episode is up for serious debate, sharp academic disagreement, and religious controversy. The Sefer Yetzirah is just so enigmatic and difficult that no scholarly consensus has emerged in the past 150 years of it being studied. And I suspect that no consensus is going to appear anytime soon. I just want you to know that I'm providing you with the best information that I can, given that the Sefer Yetzirah is just one of the most controversial texts in the history of Kabbalah. So think of the positions that I come to in this episode more as the beginning of a conversation than the result of settled academic scholarly consensus. And I welcome any contrary viewpoints in the comments. That said, Rabbinic Judaism has always had a kind of allergy when it comes to speculation about the beginning of the world or the hereafter. When prompted with the question, what happens to us when we die, it isn't uncommon to see learned rabbis simply shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know, I'm not dead yet. This allergy appears as early as the Talmudic literature, where speculation about the origin of the cosmos, or Ma'aseh Bereshit, is basically discouraged. It is surprising, therefore, to see that one of the central texts of the Kabbalah will become the Sefer Yetzirah, or the Book of Formation, a book not just exploring, but expounding upon that very issue. The Sefer Yetzirah is a book of Jewish cosmogony marked by its incredible brevity. It's only about 2,000 words in an average recension. The authorship of the book is traditionally ascribed to the patriarch Abraham, given a later quasi-magical understanding of Genesis 12:5 that describes the, quote, souls that he, Abraham, made in Haran. The literal reading of the text that Abraham made the souls in Haran prompted some rabbis to ascribe to Abraham mystical powers, hence the link with the Sefer Yetzirah. The text is extant in several recensions, making it difficult, probably impossible, to ever recreate an ur-text, if one ever existed. There is no scholarly consensus about when the text was composed, with solid arguments urging dates all the way from the turn of the Common Era to when the text first appears in commentaries in the 10th century. So it was written sometime in the first 1,000 years of the Common Era. I know, it's really helpful. I'll provide the date that I go with and why in just a moment if you're curious. What may be the earliest mentions of the text can be found in the Talmudic literature. specifically two rather strange stories found in Tractate Sanhedrin at 65 and 67b. The story at 67b might be slightly earlier, so let's start there. What we have is a discussion about what is constitutive of sorcery and therefore subject to the death penalty. What is mentioned as permitted is a situation in which two rabbis, Rabbi Hanina and Rabbi Oshaya, study something that text refers to as Hilchot Yetzirah, and create a third grown calf, an igla tilta, and eat it in celebration of Shabbat. And what appears to be a later story, although found earlier in the Gemara, is a claim that if they wanted to, the quote, righteous could create a world, an olam. To show this, it recounts a tale in which Rabbi Nachmani created a man, an ish, and sent it to Rabbi Zerah, who, on the account of the muteness of this man, knew that it was, quote, from the sages, this is probably a metaphor for sorcery, and then ordered the man, quote, back to your dust. After this, the previous story of Rabbi Hanina and Rabbi Oshai is repeated, with them now studying, quote, Sefer Yetzirah, by which they make the calf. Just what the difference between Hilchot Yetzirah and Sefer Yetzirah isn't clear from the text, if there was any difference at all. Typically, Sefer refers to a discrete book or scroll, whereas Hilchot is typically more vague, and is typically found to describe how something is to be done properly, or the laws surrounding a certain practice. For instance, Hilchot Avilut describe the customs and laws around ritual mourning, though it is possible that one could entitle a book in such a manner. Regardless, already by the time of the Babylonian Talmud, say around 500 of the Common Era, if not earlier given the figures in these stories, there already exists some sense that by studying the laws or processes surrounding creation, that this might allow the righteous godlike powers over creation, though it is possible, perhaps even likely, that Sefer Yetzirah is a later interpolation into the text. Further, we can't know if the texts or customs described in this section of the Babylonian Talmud are the same that have come down to us in the recensions that we now call the Sefer Yetzirah. So just because a book was entitled Sefer Yetzirah in the Babylonian Talmud doesn't mean that the book that's come down to us is in fact the same text. But it's certainly intriguing just the same. Before we leave the Talmud, there's one more important story about the relationship between letters and creation that will become central in the Sefer Yetzirah. In Tractate Berachot at 55b, we have a curious account in which God is describing to Moses how to build the Mishkan, or tabernacle. Moses then takes these instructions to the craftsman Bezalel, but reverses the order of creation for some reason. As you may remember, Moses was never that great at speaking anyhow. Here, Bezalel actually corrects Moses, showing a kind of preternatural wisdom, or chokhmah, for which Moses remarks that he was, quote, in the shadow, playing on Bezalel's name. Bezalel means in the shadow of God. Further, it's noted, and this is key, that Bezalel knew how to, quote, join the letters by which heaven and earth were created. This is derived from a verse at Exodus 31:3, describing Bezalel as filled with the Spirit of God and, quote, having wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Now this story isn't just important because my Hebrew name also happens to be Bezalel, but because already here in the Talmud, the act of creation is linked with the ability to join letters. But that certain righteous people may also be able to accomplish a kind of theurgy. In fact, the creation of the Mishkan, or tabernacle, closely parallels the early Genesis creation story, with Bezalel acting as a kind of demiurge. In the centuries that follow the completion of the Babylonian Talmud, Judaism enters a kind of temporary dark age, where surviving manuscripts of any kind become spare, and literature of all kinds is reduced to a trickle, if that. This likely has to do with the political convulsions of the Near East at this time, given the military conquest of the armies of Islam in the region. When the area is stabilized, however, Jewish literature reappears in spades, and it is in that period that the Sefer Yetzirah appears in history as we know it today. So, when do I think the text was written? First, as you can see on the screen, there's a wide range of estimates and contexts given by various scholars. Personally, I'm very convinced by the work of Tzahi Weiss, who locates the matrix of the Sefer Yetzirah in a non- or para-rabbinic setting, though likely in a larger Greco-Syriac context sometime in the 7th century. His argument, to my mind at least, is significantly bolstered by his comparative analysis of Greco-Syriac texts, which are similar and adjacent to the Sefer Yetzirah, both in form and in content. Though I do think that the Sefer Yetzirah does contain a memory reaching back into the Gnostic context, for reasons that I'll discuss in a moment. The debate about the matrix of the Sefer Yetzirah isn't going to end anytime soon, and I encourage you to read Weiss's work along with the 8,794 other theories about the origins of the Sefer Yetzirah. But that's where I land right now, and I'm sure in a future episode of Esoterica I'll be telling you how wrong I was. Further, I'm also convinced that the Sefer Yetzirah has always straddled the line between being a scientific philosophical text in the style of the pre-Socratic Greeks and being a theosophical theurgical text, which, through some obscure means, provides quasi-magical powers to its readers and performers. This is much in the same way that I read Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, as being at least in part a polemic against the Merkavah Hechelot mysticism. If you're interested in the Hechelot Merkavah mysticism, check out the card above. I've made a separate episode just on it. In this way, I see the early scientific philosophical commentaries on the Sefer Yetzirah by figures such as the Saadia Gaon, Shabbatai Donolo, and Yehuda Barzilai as seeking at some level to counter this theosophical theurgical reading of the text. As we'll see, it's precisely this understanding of the text that will re-emerge in the 12th century and prove to be the most enduring, especially on the strength of the Golem legends. As I just mentioned, the earliest evidence of the text as we have it emerged in commentaries beginning in the 10th century. It's also important to note that the earliest manuscript that we have of the Sefer Yetzirah dates exactly to this time period, and was found in the Cairo Geniza. As you may know, a Geniza is a storehouse in which Jewish texts can be stored until they are ritually buried. What is great about the Geniza of the Ibn Ezra Synagogue in Cairo were that hundreds of thousands of fragments were stored there for nearly a millennium. Luckily for us, someone forgot to bury them all. The recensions of the Sefer Yetzirah that have come down to us vary in length, from around 1,300 words in the short recension to about 2,700 words in the longer recensions. Exactly what the text looked like prior to the 10th century isn't clear. Several recensions were already circulating by then. But after the 10th century, 3 recensions became basically the most popular, as evidenced by the mountain of commentary and meta-commentary literature that has appeared in the last 1,000 years. I should also say that the closest thing we have to a critical edition of the Sefer Yetzirah also refers to the manuscript situation as, quote, textual chaos, because it isn't enough that the content of the text is among the most enigmatic in history, but even the manuscript situation is a complete nightmare. So, fun, right? Welcome back. The best argument for an ur-text of the Sefer Yetzirah has been made by Peter Hayman, who sees the recension used by the Saadia Gaon in his commentary of 931 as the closest to the original text. That edition is also very close to the one found in the Cairo Geniza mentioned earlier. The longer recensions, such as Vatican Manuscript 299, includes a bit more material that seems to have been appended to the text early on in its creation. I'm electing to base this episode on using a longer recension, specifically Vatican Manuscript 299, but checking any interpretive work I do against Hayman's conjectural earliest recoverable text. This allows for a bit more flexibility and unpacking for an already difficult text, but allows the Hayman reconstruction to pump the brakes, so to speak, on getting too far away from the core logic, structure, and content of the quote original text. The text itself is a brief though densely packed cosmogony, which details the process of creation from the 10 Sephirot Belima, along with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, an onto-alphabetical analysis of the sounds of the Hebrew language, along with the correspondences to these sounds or letters with what the text takes to be the 3 registers of reality: the cosmic, the temporal, and the physical human body. Given that this is all crammed into about 2,000 words, you can imagine that the text is taciturn in the extreme, and it does not give away its secrets easily. The initial discussion is perhaps the most famous. Here we encounter the term Sephirot for the first time in Jewish literature, though this neologism isn't clear from the context. It's clearly the plural of Sephirah, another neologism from the root meaning something like to count or number, though we would expect the noun form to be mispar or misparim, just a common word for a number. But the writer here is clearly up to something novel and therefore creates a new word. Further, the text typically uses Sephirot Belima as one phrase. The problem being that the word Belima doesn't make anything any clearer. This word is also mysterious. It occurs only once in the entire Hebrew Bible, therefore making it a hapax legomenon, and it only appears in the book of Job, a work already filled with enigmatic Hebrew words. So just to get started, the situation here is great. We have a completely made-up word attached to a word that's only used once in one of the most enigmatic books of the Bible. Fantastic. I should also point out that whatever the Sephirot Belima are, we should be careful to note that we're not yet talking about the Sephirot of the later system of the Kabbalah as it's developed in the Sefer Bahir and later in the Zohar. And I think it would be a bit of a mistake to read those later systems back onto the earlier Sefer Yetzirah. Further, even in the later period of the development of the Proto-Kabbalah, those kabbalists haven't even completely made up their mind about exactly how many Sephirot they're going to be. The Iyun circle, for instance, insists that there are in fact 13 Sephirot, which makes a bit more sense, given that God is typically thought to have 13 rather than 10 attributes in classical Judaism. So whatever the Sephirot Belima are in the Sefer Yetzirah, they do not yet appear to be the hypostatic emanations of the later Kabbalah. So what are these Sephirot Belima? It appears from the text that they are numerico-ontological principles very similar to those found in Pythagorean and Neoplatonic forms of speculation. Recall that the tetrachus was a sacred symbol for the Pythagoreans, and 10 has a sense of completeness in the thought of someone like Proclus. Further, from these Sephirot Belima seem to emerge two different sets of entities or correspondences. In the first place, there are the dimensions, or the ketzavot, the extremities as the text calls them. These are two dimensions of time, beginning and ending, two moral dimensions of good and evil, two absolute spatial dimensions of above and below, along with the four cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. This is followed by a second set, for lack of a better word, of what the 10 Sephirot Belima are. In this second enumeration, what first emerges is speech in the form of the Holy Spirit. From that speech emerges the element of air, in which the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet are engraved, followed by the element of water in the form of the tohu vavohu, or the primordial chaos. Then, emerging from this water, is fire, from which the divine throne and the ministering angels are hewn. To these four is added the use of a divine name, Yod He Vav, which is permutated in various ways and then used to seal the extremities, or the ketzavot, of the various aspects of the universe, using the cardinal and absolute directions from the first enumeration. This appears to logically synthesize the two enumeration schemata. Before moving on, you may be wondering why the text deploys a 3-letter name for God rather than the more typical 4-letter Yod He Vav He name for the Israelite God. That's an incredibly good question, and scholars are still arguing about just why the text uses a 3-letter rather than 4-letter name for God. What we do know is that there's a long textual tradition linking the creation of the cosmos not only with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, but with the specific 4 letters of the divine name in Hebrew, Yod He Vav He. At some point in antiquity, for reasons that aren't terribly clear, though by at least the period of the Merkava or chariot mysticism, it appears that a kind of Occam's razor has been applied to the divine name, whereby the final He has been removed for reasons, again, that aren't terribly clear, thus leaving a more primeval divine name, Yod He Vav. This more esoteric divine name is widely attested, however. We see this name appearing in the Greek magical papyri, but also in many Gnostic texts as Iota Alpha Omega. This seems to link the Sefer Yetzirah with the Merkava Hechalot mysticism, and I think further to the magical/Gnostic literature of the late classical world. This should be unsurprising given how interested Gnostic literature is in the origin of the cosmos, though it should be pointed out in Sefer Yetzirah that there's very little evidence of dualism appearing in the text. The cosmos of the Sefer Yetzirah, much like the Hebrew Bible, is fundamentally a reflection of the will of the Creator, and thereby basically good. From this synthetic statement capping the two enumerative schemes, the Sephirot Belima are never mentioned again in the Sefer Yetzirah. At this point, the text shifts its attention to a systematic, though idiosyncratic, analysis of Hebrew phonetics as a metaphysical, specifically ontological principle. The letters are divided into the points of articulation within the mouth of the divine speaker, and then permuted with one another, likely to explain the principle of difference and individuation in the cosmos. Different types of entities through the permutational differences in the divine Ursprach. The letters are then further subdivided into primary letters, or emot, mother letters, aleph, mem, and shin, perhaps representing gutturals, labials, and fricatives, but also the beginning, middle, and end-ish of the Hebrew alphabet. The second group are the doubles. These are letters capable of taking a dagesh, which can lengthen the sound of a consonant or switch a consonant between being voiced or unvoiced. The remaining 12 are referred to simply as the simple letters. All of this is synthesized into a kind of ontological linguistic theory, whereby biconsonantal roots are said to represent all of the entities in creation, and are represented by 221 gates, at least in the early manuscripts, and later manuscripts has the more logical 231 gates. These gates seem to be the mechanism or logical operator by which all of creation is thus enumerated. Note that this theory disagrees with the now established triconsonantal theory of the Semitic languages, though some biconsonantal root words are found in Hebrew, and they are thought to be perhaps the most primitive strata of the language. So the Sefer Yetzirah may laugh last. From here in the text, the Hebrew letters are then set into a very complex system of correspondences, for each of the 3 levels of reality as the text takes it. The the cosmos, or olam, time, or shana, or year, and the human being, or nefesh, soul. This section represents the bulk of the Sefer Yetzirah as a text, comprising nearly 4/5 in the long recension. The range here is enormous, with letters linked to various body parts, emotions and ethical dispositions, the procession of the Zodiac, the climate of the year, the physical elements, and so on. The Sefer Yetzirah begins in a kind of geometric fashion, with the most simple element, and though a process of unfolding, progression, and linguistic permutation, profuses with the totality of being itself. From divine simplicity comes the brimming pleroma. It is unsurprising, therefore, that a text which describes the process by which creation was unfolded would transform from simply being a description of that process to becoming a prescriptive text describing how one might oneself create a world, or at least another human being. The Sefer Yetzirah seems to have gone through several distinct periods of interpretation. The earliest, that is, the creation of the text itself, remains the least clear. I suspect that the text itself emerged out of a theurgical, Gnostic-adjacent, and Hechalot Merkava milieu, and was thereby associated with magic and mysticism from its very inception. Of course, I want to note that I'm conjecturing here. We have virtually no evidence about the early origins of the Sefer Yetzirah. The period of the inception of the Sefer Yetzirah prior to the 10th century remains completely mysterious. The second phase of interpretation began in the 10th century, when the Sefer Yetzirah appears in history as we know it. Here it appears in the philosophical scientific commentaries of scholars like the Tzahi Gaon, who see the text primarily as a formal treatise a la Kalam on the creation and structure of the cosmos. A few centuries later, the text appears in Central Europe, in the milieu of the Chasdei Ashkenaz, and it is here that the text becomes imbued with a deeply magical reading. It is the commentaries of this period that introduce the world to the idea of the Golem, or the artificially constructed humanoid. And don't worry, a whole episode about the Golem is going to be forthcoming here at Esoterica, so stay tuned for that. Not long after this, we begin the third period of the interpretation of the Sefer Yetzirah. Here the text is formally taken up into the enormous tide of the Kabbalah, and synthesized with the Sephirotic system developed first in the Sefer Bahir, and then more systematically deployed in the Sefer Zohar. This tide would also include Christian Kabbalah as well, with Guillaume Postel rendering the Sefer Yetzirah into Latin in 1552. Christian interest in the Sefer Yetzirah only increased over time, and much like the first printing of the Sefer Zohar at Cremona, the Sefer Yetzirah was printed in 1562 at Mantua primarily at the behest of Christians. And finally, in the 19th century, the Sefer Yetzirah was first subjected to academic investigation, with the rise of the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement. That scholarship has only blossomed over the last 150 years, revealing some mysteries, but only deepening others. The Sefer Yetzirah remains an enduring enigma, but brief and alluring enough to remain an enduring text of Western esotericism at virtually every register. If you're interested in Kabbalah, the history of magic, alchemy, and Western esotericism generally, make sure to subscribe here at Esoterica, and consider supporting our work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. The literature on the Sefer Yetzirah is vast and stretches over several languages, especially modern Hebrew. The basic introductions found in the works of Gershom Scholem remain good, although they are a bit dated at this point. There's no sense in me reinventing the wheel, and if you want the ultimate bibliography on the Sefer Yetzirah, then your best place to look is going to be in the Bibliography for the Study of the Sefer Yetzirah in English by Don Carr. It's a monumental resource and well worth taking a look at. The most convincing argument for me, for the matrix of the Sefer Yetzirah's development, is Tzahi Weiss's text, Sefer Yetzirah in its context. This clear, approachable, yet meticulous, covers a great deal of the previous scholarship on the topic, and in only 115 pages, makes a compelling analysis of the origins of the text. It also includes a transcription and translation of Vatican Manuscript 299, which is my preferred text of the Sefer Yetzirah for what it's worth. The closest thing we have to a critical edition of the Sefer Yetzirah is a text by Peter Hayman, which, if you can find used, is only $650. Welcome back. If you'd like a really beautiful edition with traditional Jewish commentaries, I would pick up the edition entitled the Sefer Yetzirah HaShalem. You can typically find it online at Orthodox Sfarim stores for about $50, which is a fair price considering that the book itself is rather beautiful and it contains the commentaries of Shabbatai Donolo along with those of the Tzahi Gaon. It's also nice because the entire book is printed in the square script rather than the traditional Rashi script of commentary literature, making it a bit easier on the eyes. I should also say something about the popular R.A.A. Kaplan edition. This would be a fine edition perhaps from the point of view of a practicing Kabbalist, and includes a great deal of scholarly material. Kaplan's text of the Sefer Yetzirah is based on that of the Vilna Gaon. This is sometimes called the Gra recension, and his analysis of the text is from the point of view of a Lurianic Kabbalist. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but I do think, from a purely academic perspective, that this perspective treats the text a bit anachronistically, reading later Kabbalistic ideas back onto the much earlier Sefer Yetzirah. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that, but from a purely academic perspective, it doesn't quite fly. It's funny that my copy of the Kaplan text was actually given to me as a teenager by our local Catholic priest. I remember him handing it to me and telling me that he couldn't make heads or tails of it, and that perhaps one day I could. Well, if you're watching this, Father Brian, I'm still working at it. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.